In a world weighed down by burdens where hope seems a distant dream, meet David. A single father, weathered by life's relentless storms, he shoulders the heavy weight of responsibility for his teenage daughter, Lily. Every day is a struggle, a tightrope walk above a chasm of bills and anxieties. But destiny, in its mysterious way, often works through the most unexpected encounters. One rainy morning, outside a bustling supermarket, David's path crosses with George, an elderly homeless man, his eyes holding untold stories and a secret whispered only in the face of eternity. In a simple act of kindness, a shared sandwich in the cold morning air, a profound connection is forged. David is about to discover that compassion can unlock doors he never knew existed, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unlikely places. But this newfound hope comes entwined with a secret, a mystery that will challenge everything David thought he knew about life, love, and the hidden depths of the human heart. Are you ready to embark on this heartwarming and transformative journey with David and George? If you believe in the power of kindness and the magic of unexpected encounters, then hit that subscribe button and join our community of story lovers. We bring you tales that resonate with the soul, stories that remind us of the beauty and resilience of the human spirit. A struggling single dad helps a homeless man, only to discover a secret that transforms his future. The insistent shrill of the alarm clock ripped David from a shallow, restless sleep. 5 a.m. Still dark, the kind of dark that felt thick enough to taste like soot and unsweetened coffee. He slapped at the snooze button, a familiar reflex honed by years of battling the early morning dread. 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes. To linger in the fading remnants of a dream he couldn't quite grasp. Something about a sun-drenched beach and laughter, a stark contrast to the gray reality pressing down on him. He swung his legs out of bed, the old mattress groaning in protest. The floorboards were cold beneath his bare feet, a familiar winter chill that seemed to have seeped into the very bones of their small apartment. He shuffled towards the kitchen, his joints stiff, each movement a quiet ache. Another day. Another. Mountain to climb. The kitchen was cramped and dimly lit, the air thick with the lingering scent of yesterday's dinner, probably burnt toast and something vaguely resembling soup. He switched on the overhead light, a flickering fluorescent tube that cast a harsh, unflattering glare over the worn linoleum and cluttered countertops. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, catching his reflection in the darkened microwave. Door. The face staring back was tired, etched with lines that seemed to deepen with each passing year. 42, he reminded himself. Though some days he felt closer to 60. He started the coffee maker, the gurgling sound a small comfort in the pre-dawn stillness. While it brewed, he pulled out a box of cereal and a carton of milk. Breakfast. Of champions, he thought wryly. For a champion of, well, just surviving. A small, sleepy voice drifted from the hallway. Dad? Lily. His daughter. The single bright spark in the persistent gloom of his life. Morning, kiddo, he called out, forcing a cheerfulness he didn't quite feel. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her teenage frame still softened by the lingering embrace of slumber. Even in her worn pajamas, with her hair tousled and messy, she possessed a beauty that always caught him off guard, a fragile, burgeoning beauty that reminded him so much of her mother. A pang of something, sharp and bittersweet, twisted in his chest. Morning, she mumbled back, her voice still thick with sleep. She slumped onto a kitchen stool, her movements economical, as if conserving energy for the day ahead. David poured her a bowl of cereal and placed it in front of her, along with a glass of milk. He watched her eat, his gaze lingering on her face, searching for any sign of worry or strain. Lily carried her own burdens, he knew, the quiet anxieties of adolescence, the pressures of school, the unspoken weight of their limited circumstances. He tried to shield her from as much of it as he could, but some things were simply unavoidable. He drank his coffee standing up, the bitter liquid a necessary jolt to his system. He glanced at the kitchen calendar, a jumble of scribbled appointments and reminders. Car payment due, Lily, dentist, warehouse, double shift. Each entry felt like another weight added to the invisible burden he carried. "Don't forget your history paper is due today," he reminded Lily, gently, breaking the silence. She sighed, a dramatic teenage sigh that was almost comical in its exaggeration. "I know, Dad. Almost finished." He knew almost finished probably meant barely started, but he let it slide. He was too tired to nag, and frankly, Lily was a good kid, responsible and hard-working, despite everything. He trusted her to get it done. They finished breakfast, in a comfortable silence, a familiar routine that had become the bedrock of their small family unit. He walked her to the bus stop, the early morning air biting at their faces. The bus was already rumbling down the street, a yellow behemoth swallowing up sleepy teenagers and spitting them out at the doors of Westview High. He watched until the bus disappeared around the corner, a small ache settling in his chest. Then, he turned and headed towards his own transportation, his battered 15-year-old pickup truck, affectionately nicknamed the Beast, despite its current more docile and sputtering state. The engine coughed and wheezed, protesting the early morning start before finally sputtering to life. As he drove, the dashboard warning light for check engine blinked insistently, a persistent nagging reminder of yet another expense he couldn't afford. He ignored it, like he ignored so many things these days, tucking his worries away into the already overflowing compartments of his mind. The warehouse district was still waking up, the air heavy with the smell of diesel and damp concrete. He parked the Beast in its usual spot, a dented space near the loading dock, and stepped out into the chilly morning air. The warehouse loomed before him, a vast gray box, promising another day of repetitive back-breaking labor. He pulled his worn work gloves from his pocket, the leather cracked and softened with age. As he approached the entrance, he noticed something unusual by the dumpster, a huddled shape wrapped in a tattered blanket. A homeless man, he realized, taking refuge from the lingering morning chill. He'd seen them around before, fleeting, figures on the edges of their busy world, easily ignored, easily forgotten. He was about to walk past when he saw the man shift slightly, his head lifting. Their eyes met for a brief, fleeting moment. The man's eyes were old, weary, but held a surprising spark of something. Intelligence? Resignation? David couldn't quite place it. Something in those eyes stopped him in his tracks. Against his better judgment, against the pressing demands of his own schedule, David veered slightly off course, heading towards the huddled figure by the dumpster. "Morning," he said, his voice quiet, unsure. He wasn't even sure why he was stopping. Habit, maybe. Politeness ingrained from a childhood long past. Or maybe, just maybe, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Compassion. The man looked up at him, his face shadowed by the grime of the streets and a few days' growth of gray stubble. He didn't say anything, just looked at David with those tired, knowing eyes. David hesitated, then reached into his work bag, pulling out the apple he'd packed for lunch. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Here," he offered, extending the apple towards the man. "It's not much, but..." The homeless man's gaze flickered from David's face to the apple, then back again. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Thank you," the man rasped, his voice surprisingly deep, a voice that hinted at a life lived differently, a life before the streets. "That's kind of you." David simply nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say next. He just stood there for another moment, feeling the weight of his own burdens. And for the first time that morning, a flicker of something else too, something that felt a little less like burden and a little more like connection. Then, with a sigh, he turned and walked towards the warehouse, the gray building looming before him, the day's work beckoning. But the image of the man by the dumpster, the weariness in his eyes, the unexpected gratitude in his voice, lingered in his mind. A small, unsettling seed planted in the already fertile ground of his worries. The weight on his shoulders felt, somehow just a little bit different now. He wasn't sure why, not yet. The rhythm of the conveyor belt was relentless, a metallic heartbeat echoing through the cavernous warehouse. Box after box slid past David, each one a faceless unit in an endless stream of merchandise destined for anonymous shelves in stores he would likely never see. He moved with practiced efficiency, his body operating on autopilot, his mind miles away, replaying the morning's brief encounter by the dumpster. The homeless man, George, he'd learned his name was, from a mumbled reply to a hesitant question. George. The name felt incongruous with the image of the weathered face, the tattered blanket, the weary resignation in his eyes. It sounded like a name for a professor, a doctor, a businessman, not someone seeking shelter behind a dumpster on a cold morning. David wrestled with a familiar discomfort. Guilt, maybe, or just a nagging unease. He'd given George an apple, a meager offering that barely scratched the surface of the man's obvious need. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. He knew the gnawing feeling well, this constant awareness of his own inadequacy, his inability to fix everything, to make everything right, for Lily, for himself, for the world. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the monotonous task at hand. Work was work. It paid the bills barely, but it paid them. Dwelling on things he couldn't change wouldn't help. He had Lily to think about, rent to pay, that damn car. But the image of George lingered, a persistent shadow at the edge of his awareness. He found himself glancing out the loading dock doors more often than usual, half expecting, half dreading to see the huddled figure reappear. He didn't. The morning chill gave way to a gray, overcast day, the promise of rain hanging heavy in the air. By late afternoon, the first drops began to fall, fat and splattering against the corrugated metal roof of the warehouse. The sound intensified, building into a steady drumming, a relentless percussive rhythm that seemed to amplify the weariness in David's bones. As his shift ended, the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the warehouse district into a blurry watercolor of gray and silver. He pulled his collar up against the wind, hurrying towards the beast, the familiar anxiety tightening in his chest. Lily would be home alone. He hoped she'd remembered to lock the door, hoped she wasn't scared by the storm. He was about to climb into his truck when he saw him again. George. He was huddled beneath the inadequate shelter of a bus stop bench. Across the street, rain plastering his thin hair to his forehead, his blanket soaked and clinging to his frame. He looked even more frail, more vulnerable than he had that morning. A surge of something powerful, undeniable, washed over David. It wasn't just pity, not just guilt. It was a raw, visceral pull of compassion, a feeling so strong it felt almost like a physical ache. He couldn't drive away and leave him there. Not in this storm, not tonight. He hesitated for only a heartbeat, then made a sudden decision. He crossed the street against the light, dodging a spray of water from a passing car, and approached the bus stop bench. "George," he called out, his voice barely audible above the roar of the rain. George looked up, startled, his eyes widening, slightly in recognition. He didn't say anything, just watched David approach, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "Hey," David said, his voice gentler now. "Look, it's really coming down out here. You can't stay here all night." George shrugged, a weary, resigned gesture. "Got nowhere else to go." His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper above the storm's din. David glanced around. The street deserted, the rain relentless. "Look," he said again, impulsively, the words tumbling out before he'd fully considered them. "Come back to the warehouse with me. It's dry in there, and warmer than this anyway. Just for tonight." George hesitated, his eyes searching David's face as if trying to discern his motives, his intentions. Suspicion warred with a desperate, unspoken hope. I don't want to be trouble," George finally mumbled, his voice barely audible. "No, trouble," David said quickly, firmly. "Seriously, just come on, let's get you out of this rain." He extended a hand, a silent offer of help, of trust. After another long moment of hesitation, George slowly reached out and took it. His hand was cold, surprisingly fragile in David's grasp. Together, they walked back across the street, the rain soaking them both despite David's hurried pace. They reached the loading dock entrance, David fumbling for his keys, unlocking the heavy metal door. He ushered George inside, into the cavernous echoing space of the darkened warehouse. The sudden silence after the storm's roar was almost deafening. The air inside was cool, damp, but undeniably dry, a sanctuary from the relentless downpour. David switched on a few overhead lights, casting long shadows that danced and flickered across rows of stacked boxes and towering metal shelves. The warehouse, in the muted light of the storm-lashed night, felt vast, empty, almost lonely. He led George to a relatively clear corner, away from the main loading area. He found a couple of old blankets tucked away in a storage bin and offered them to George. "Here," he said, handing them over. "Not exactly the Ritz, but it's dry." George gratefully accepted the blankets, wrapping them around himself, shivering slightly despite the relative warmth. He sank down onto the concrete floor, leaning against a stack of boxes, exhaustion etched deep in his face. David stood there for a moment, watching him, unsure what to do next. He felt a strange mix of emotions: relief at having gotten George out of the storm, a lingering unease about bringing a stranger into his workplace, and a burgeoning sense of connection. "You hungry?" David asked finally, breaking the silence. I got a couple of granola bars in my bag. Not much, but..." George looked up at him, his tired eyes softening slightly. "Granola bar sounds good," he whispered, a faint, almost hesitant smile touching his lips. David rummaged in his bag, finding the granola bars and handing them over. He watched as George slowly unwrapped one, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. He ate slowly, methodically, savoring each bite as if it were a feast. David sat down on an overturned crate a few feet away, the silence stretching between them, punctuated only by the drumming rain outside and the faint rustling of George unwrapping his granola bar. He looked at George, really looked at him for the first time, studying the lines etched on his face, the weariness in his eyes, the quiet dignity that still flickered beneath the grime and hardship. Who was this man? What had his life been? How had he ended up here, seeking shelter in a warehouse on a rainy night, relying on the kindness of a stranger for a granola bar? The questions hung unspoken in the air, heavy and unanswered. But in the shared silence, in the muted light of the warehouse, something was shifting subtly, imperceptibly, in the space between them. A fragile bridge was forming, built on a foundation of simple human compassion, in the heart of a stormy night. In the days that followed, an odd rhythm established itself. Every lunchtime, as his morning shift ended, David would make his way to the corner of the warehouse where George had taken refuge. He'd bring his lunch, usually a simple sandwich, and an apple, and share it with the homeless man. George, in turn, began to open up bit by bit. He'd share fragmented stories of his life, fleeting memories of a bygone era when he'd been a successful businessman, owning a thriving chain of restaurants. George's voice, though still raspy and weak, held a surprisingly warm and refined timbre. He possessed a deep knowledge of literature, history, and even classical music. David was astonished to discover that beneath the tattered exterior and dire circumstances was a man of experience, wisdom, and a quiet dignity that still flickered brightly. They talked for hours in the hushed stillness of the warehouse, the sound of rain outside long since replaced by the weak winter sunlight filtering through the high windows. George spoke of poor decisions made in his past, of brutal business setbacks, and the loneliness that descended as loved ones drifted away. David listened without judgment, offering only empathy and shared silence. He realized that despite their vastly different lives, both men carried burdens of loneliness and unspoken pain deep within. This unexpected and unusual friendship gradually became an integral part of David's workday. He looked forward to those lunch breaks, to talking with George, to feeling a rare warmth amidst the daily grind. George, conversely, seemed to find solace and a small measure of joy in this newfound companionship. His health, however, continued to decline. persistent coughing fits, a hollow, ashen face, a visibly labored gait with every movement. The signs were unmistakable. One evening, as David worked his night shift at the warehouse, a loud thud echoed from their usual corner. He rushed over, heart pounding in his chest, and was horrified to find George lying motionless on the concrete floor, gasping for breath, clutching his chest in agony. The rain had returned, howling fiercely outside, but even its roar seemed to be swallowed by George's labored breathing in the cavernous silence of the warehouse. Without a second thought, David knelt beside George, gently lifting him and supporting him towards his truck. He sped to the nearest emergency room, his mind a whirlwind of anxiety and fear. At the hospital, doctors immediately took charge of George, whisking him away into the emergency room. David sat alone in the waiting area, silently praying for his newfound friend. Time stretched, heavy and slow, the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows mimicking a mournful lament. Finally, a doctor emerged, his expression grave. "We did everything we could," he said, his voice somber. He suffered a massive myocardial infarction. His age, his pre-existing conditions, compounded by prolonged illness and malnutrition. "I'm afraid we lost him." David went numb, disbelief washing over him. George gone. A wave of loss hit him unexpectedly hard. Despite their brief acquaintance, the bond between them had become deeper than he'd realized. In the quiet hospital room, beside the empty bed, David lingered beside George. His face was peaceful, as if asleep, the lines of weariness seemingly smoothed away. David gently took George's cold hand in his, feeling a hollowness and a pang of deep loss that resonated in his own chest. Suddenly, he noticed something small clutched tightly in George's hand. David carefully unfurled his fingers and saw an old tarnished key and a small crumpled piece of paper with a sequence of numbers scrawled in faded ink. David looked down at George one last time, a mixture of emotions swirling within him. Sadness, grief, and an inexplicable sense of gratitude. He remembered George's last words in his dying moments, whispered words about his past as a successful businessman and a forgotten secret bank account overseas. Find those assets and use them wisely. George's words echoed in David's mind, a final wish, a quiet plea, and also a heavy weight settling onto his shoulders. He stared at the key and the code in his hand, a strange sensation rising within him. Could this be the key to a new future, or just a cruel trick of fate? Leaving the hospital in the torrential rain, David carried the key and the coded paper, along with a heart heavy with grief and doubt. The small apartment felt quieter and emptier than ever. Lily was fast asleep, unaware of what had just transpired. David sat silently at the kitchen table, gazing at the old key and the mysterious numbers, a profound question forming in his mind. Did George's secret truly exist? And could it really change his life? Lily's life? Forever? The weak winter sunlight filtering through the blinds did little to dispel the gloom that had settled over David's small apartment. He woke with a leaden feeling, a hollowness where hope should have been, the loss of George still a fresh ache in his chest. The old tarnished key and the crumpled paper with its cryptic sequence lay on his kitchen table, stark reminders of the previous night and the dying man's last words. David stared at them, a wave of doubt washing over him. A secret, Swiss bank account, a forgotten fortune. It all sounded too fantastical, more like a fairy tale spun for the downtrodden than a reality that could touch someone like him. A struggling single dad barely keeping his head above water. Maybe George had just been delirious. His final words. The rambling of a lonely, desperate soul clinging to a delusion. Logic, reason, years of hard knocks and unmet expectations. They all screamed skepticism. Yet something deep within David, a flicker of something stubborn and persistent, urged him to seek the truth. Perhaps it was simple human curiosity, the innate desire to unravel a mystery. Or maybe it was a fragile spark of hope igniting in the darkness of his own life, a desperate grasp at the possibility of change. Or perhaps, most simply, it was respect, a quiet honoring of George, the man who had, in his final moments, placed his trust, however misplaced, in David. After dropping Lily at school, instead of heading straight to the warehouse and the soul-numbing monotony of his shift, David made a detour to the public library downtown. He found a quiet corner tucked away amongst the towering bookshelves, powered up his ancient laptop, and began to delve into the labyrinthine world of online information. He typed keywords into the search engine: Swiss bank accounts, international inheritance law, overseas probate procedures. A torrent of results flooded the screen, a chaotic jumble of legal jargon, financial regulations, and cautionary tales of scams and fruitless searches. David waded through the digital thicket, his brow furrowed in concentration, his eyes straining. To decipher the dense text, he quickly realized he was out of his depth. The legal complexities, the financial terminology, the sheer volume of information, it was overwhelming. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of acronyms and legal precedents, the initial spark of hope dwindling with each passing minute. A wave of discouragement washed over him, the familiar urge to just give up, to retreat back into the safe, predictable misery of his everyday routine. But then, George's face flashed in his mind, the weariness etched into every line, the quiet, dignity in his faded eyes. David straightened his spine, took a deep breath, and pushed on. He wouldn't give up, not yet. He owed George that much, at least. During his lunch break at the warehouse, David confided in Chris, his closest friend, a guy who knew his way around numbers and had a practical head on his shoulders. Chris listened intently as David recounted the bizarre tale of George and the secret inheritance, the key, the code, the whole improbable story. When David finished, Chris leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "Wow," Chris said slowly, exhaling a low whistle. "That's something else, Dave. Sounds like something out of a movie." He paused, considering. "Look, I'm no expert on international finance, but it's not impossible, I guess. Stranger things have happened, but you gotta be careful. Buddy, inheritance stuff, especially overseas, that's a whole different ballgame. Legal minefield, you know?" Chris leaned forward, his expression serious. "If you're serious about looking into this, Dave, you need to talk to a lawyer. A real lawyer. Someone who knows this kind of stuff inside and out. Don't go trying to navigate this on your own. You'll get eaten alive." Chris's words, though cautious, were oddly encouraging. They validated David's instinct that this was something he couldn't handle alone, and provided a clear next step. That evening, after Lily was asleep, David returned to his laptop, his search now focused and purposeful. Inheritance lawyers, estate attorneys, international asset recovery. He scrolled through websites, read client reviews, compared firm profiles, until Anderson and Associates caught his eye. Their website was sleek, professional, boasting a team of experienced attorneys specializing in complex financial and state matters. They were located downtown, in one of the gleaming office towers that symbolized a world away from David's own reality. He hesitated, feeling a pang of self-doubt. Would a prestigious law firm like that even consider taking on a case like his based on nothing but a homeless man's deathbed confession and a tarnished key? But Chris's advice echoed in his mind. "You need to talk to a lawyer." He steeled himself, took another deep breath, and clicked the Contact Us button. He filled out the online form, briefly outlining his situation, and requested consultation. The appointment was scheduled for the following afternoon. As the day approached, David felt a growing knot of anxiety in his stomach. He laid out his best clothes, a slightly faded dress shirt, a pair of reasonably presentable slacks, trying to project an image of competence, of seriousness, despite the threadbare reality of his life. Anderson and Associates occupied the 40th floor of a gleaming skyscraper in the heart of downtown. Stepping out of the elevator, David felt instantly out of place. The hushed, opulent lobby, the polished marble floors, the modern art on the walls, the air thick with the scent of expensive leather and unspoken power. It was a world completely foreign to him, a world he usually only glimpsed from the outside, through the tinted windows of passing buses. A sleek, impeccably dressed receptionist greeted him with a practiced smile and led him to a consultation room. Ms. Anderson will be with you shortly, Mr. Dawson, she said, her voice smooth and professional. David sat down in a plush leather armchair, his hands clammy, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The room was minimalist and modern, all clean lines and muted colors, a stark contrast to the cluttered chaos of his apartment. He felt like an imposter, a trespasser in a world he didn't belong to. Then the door opened, and Sarah Anderson entered. She was even more striking in person than her website photo suggested. Around 35, he guessed, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a neat, professional bun, her eyes sharp and intelligent, assessing him with a cool, almost detached gaze. There was an air of quiet confidence about her, a sense of competence that was both reassuring and slightly intimidating. "Mr. Dawson," she said, extending a hand, her grip firm and businesslike. "Sarah Anderson, thank you for coming in." David stood, shaking her hand, feeling the cool professionalism in her touch. "Thank you for seeing me, Ms. Anderson." Sarah gestured for him to sit again, settling into the chair opposite him. She opened a file on her desk, her gaze focused and direct. "So, Mr. Dawson," she began, her voice calm and measured, "you contacted us regarding a rather unusual matter. I understand you have a story to tell?" David took a deep breath and began to speak. He recounted the story of George, the homeless man, their unlikely friendship, the rainy night in the warehouse, the heart attack, the dying confession, the key, the code. He told it all, honestly, meticulously, laying out the fragmented pieces of the puzzle as clearly and concisely as he could, despite the lingering doubt gnawing at his own mind. Sarah listened in silence, her expression unreadable, her gaze unwavering. She didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't betray any flicker of disbelief or amusement. She simply listened, her sharp, intelligent eyes absorbing every detail, every nuance of his improbable tale. And as David spoke, recounting the strange, almost unbelievable story of George and the secret inheritance, he felt a tiny spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time begin to flicker within him again. A spark of hope. Perhaps this quest for truth wouldn't be a completely futile endeavor after all. Sarah Anderson leaned back in her leather office chair, the old key and crumpled paper David had provided resting on the polished mahogany surface in front of her. She steepled her fingers, her gaze fixed on the worn objects, her mind already dissecting the fragmented story he'd presented. A homeless man, a deathbed confession, a secret bank account in Switzerland. It sounded improbable. Even for the realm of improbable cases she often encountered in inheritance law, this one felt particularly far-fetched. Yet there was something in David's earnest demeanor, the quiet sincerity in his eyes that gave her pause. He wasn't delusional, she'd sensed that immediately. He was tired, burdened, perhaps a little desperate, but genuinely decent. Her initial professional instinct screamed caution. Due diligence, verify, double-check, triple-check. Inheritance claims, especially those involving overseas accounts and vaguely defined relationships, were rife with potential pitfalls, scams, and dead ends. Her firm, Anderson & Associates, had built its reputation on meticulous research and airtight cases, not on chasing after whispers and hunches. Still, something about this case intrigued her. Perhaps it was the sheer audacity of it, the David versus Goliath. Underdog quality of a struggling single father chasing after a phantom fortune based on the word of a homeless man. Or perhaps it was simply a welcome distraction from the usual, often predictable cases that crossed her desk. The bitter estate battles between wealthy siblings, the complex trust funds and tax loopholes, the endless legal minutiae of the fluent. She picked up the key, its aged metal cool and smooth against her fingertips. She turned it over, examining its intricate carvings, feeling a faint whisper of history, mystery. Nonsense, she chided herself internally. It was just an old key, but the paper, the crumpled piece of paper with the handwritten numbers. That was a different story. She'd already run the sequence through a preliminary code analysis program her firm utilized for deciphering cryptic documents. The results were inconclusive but interesting. The numbers weren't random. They had structure, a pattern that suggested a deliberate code, possibly an account number, or a safety deposit box, or something else entirely. She swiveled her chair towards her computer, the soft leather creaking beneath her. Time for some preliminary digging. She began to type, her fingers flying across the keyboard, initiating a series of discrete online searches, accessing databases, cross-referencing names and dates, following the faint digital breadcrumbs that might lead her to the truth, or at least to a clearer picture of the puzzle David had presented. Hours later, the afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across her office. The computer screen glowed in the dimming room, displaying a series of fragmented pieces, unconnected threads, whispers from the past. She hadn't found a smoking gun, no definitive proof of a secret Swiss bank account, but she'd unearthed enough anomalies, enough intriguing coincidences to pique her professional curiosity further. There was a George Albright listed in several old business directories, matching the time frame and general description David had provided. A restaurant chain owner, successful then, vanished, like David said. There were also whispers of financial troubles, a messy bankruptcy, rumors of overseas investments. Intriguing, but still circumstantial. Far from enough to justify launching a full-scale international asset search. Yet, she glanced again at the key and the code, a sudden thought sparking in her mind. What if there was something to this improbable story? What if David, against all odds, was actually on to something? The potential reward, not just financially, but intellectually, professionally, was considerable. She made a decision. Cautious, measured, but a decision nonetheless. She would take the case, at least for an initial exploratory phase. She would utilize the firm's resources, her own expertise, to delve deeper into the mystery. If it proved to be a wild goose chase, they would cut their losses. But if there was something real here, she picked up her phone and dialed David's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice hesitant, almost wary. "Mr. Dawson," she said, her tone professional but subtly warmer than their previous meeting. "This is Sarah Anderson from Anderson and Associates. I've done some preliminary research on the information you provided." A pause then. "And?" David's voice was tight with anticipation. "And it's intriguing," Sarah admitted, choosing her words carefully. "Inconclusive, certainly, but there are some elements that warrant further investigation." She could almost feel the shift in his demeanor, the subtle release of tension, the fragile bloom of hope. "So, you believe me?" he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. Sarah hesitated again. "I believe there's enough here to warrant further inquiry, Mr. Dawson. Whether it leads to anything concrete remains to be seen, but I'm willing to proceed on a contingency basis." Contingency basis? David's voice was laced with confusion. Sarah explained the terms of her proposed partnership. Anderson and Associates would absorb the initial costs of investigation, utilizing their resources and expertise to pursue the case. If they were successful in recovering the inheritance, the firm would take a percentage, a standard industry rate, she assured him. If they failed, David would owe nothing. Silence stretched across the phone line, a beat of consideration. Sarah could almost hear the gears turning in David's mind, weighing the risks, the potential rewards, the sheer improbability of it all. "So, you're saying you'll help me?" he asked finally, his voice still laced with a thread of disbelief, but now undeniably tinged with hope. "Yes, Mr. Dawson," Sarah said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. "I am." An unlikely partnership was about to begin, and neither of them in that moment could fully grasp the transformative journey that lay ahead. The initial surge of hope that had flickered in David during his consultation with Sarah Anderson began to wane, replaced by the slow, grinding reality of their quest. The key and the code, once symbols of tantalizing mystery, now felt like cold, hard facts against the overwhelming inertia of bureaucracy and the frustrating elusiveness of the past. Sarah, true to her word, had launched a thorough preliminary investigation. She tasked her team of researchers with scouring public records, business archives, and online databases for any trace of George Albright, the restaurant chain, any hint of overseas investments. Days turned into a week, and the results trickled back in, a frustrating mix of tantalizing near hits and ultimately dead ends. Yes, there had been a George Albright who owned a chain of restaurants in the city decades ago. Albright's Eateries, they were called, a popular mid-range dining establishment that had enjoyed a brief period of success in the 70s and 80s. Newspaper clippings and faded advertisements unearthed from online archives painted a picture of a charismatic entrepreneur, a self-made man who had built his empire from the ground up. But then the trail went cold. The restaurant chain had declared bankruptcy in the late 80s, swallowed by a recession and changing consumer tastes. George Albright himself seemed to vanish from public record after that, leaving behind no forwarding address, no family contacts, no digital footprint in the modern age. "It's like he just disappeared," Sarah said one afternoon, her voice laced with a hint of frustration as she summarized their findings for David in her office. She gestured to a thick file folder overflowing with documents, printouts, and handwritten notes. "We've hit brick walls at every turn. No recent address, no known relatives, no social security trace after 1990. It's as if he ceased to exist." David listened, his shoulders slumping slightly, the familiar weight of disappointment settling back upon him. He hadn't allowed himself to truly believe in the inheritance, not really, but a small part of him, a hopeful, foolish part, had dared to dream. Now, facing the stark reality of their fruitless search, that fragile hope began to crumble. "So, that's it then?" David asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dead end?" Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious, but not entirely devoid of something. Empathy? Understanding? David couldn't quite decipher it. "Not necessarily. Mr. Dawson," she said, her tone firm. "It just means we have to dig deeper. These things take time, persistence. We haven't exhausted all avenues yet." And indeed, Sarah was far from giving up. She was, David realized, a force of nature when she set her mind to something. Over the next few days, he watched her work with a focused intensity that both impressed and slightly intimidated him. She spent hours on the phone, making calls, pulling strings, leveraging her extensive network of contacts in the legal and financial worlds. She delved into obscure historical records, chased down faded leads, and refused to accept no for an answer. David, for his part, did what he could to assist. He provided Sarah with every detail he could remember about George, every fragment of conversation, every fleeting anecdote, hoping that something, anything, might spark a new lead. He spent his evenings at the library, poring over old city directories, trying to trace George's movements after the restaurant bankruptcy, feeling like a detective in a film noir, chasing shadows in the flickering light of the past. In the midst of this increasingly challenging search, a subtle shift began to occur in the dynamic between David and Sarah. The initial professional distance, the cool formality, began to soften, imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably as the days passed. They spent hours working side by side, in Sarah's office, poring over documents, brainstorming ideas, sharing frustrations and occasional glimmers of hope. They started having lunch together in the firm's break room, their conversations drifting beyond the confines of the case, touching on their lives, their backgrounds, their hopes and dreams, and in Sarah's case, her carefully guarded vulnerabilities. David learned about Sarah's demanding work schedule, the long hours, the constant pressure to perform, the loneliness that sometimes crept in despite her professional success. He sensed a deep-seated weariness beneath her polished exterior, a quiet resilience forged in the crucible of ambition and hard work. Sarah, in turn, seemed to be drawn to David's quiet strength, his unwavering dedication to Lily, his inherent kindness and decency that shone through despite the hardships he faced. She saw past the struggling single dad, past the warehouse worker, and recognized a core of integrity and warmth that resonated with something deep within her own carefully constructed walls. One evening, late into the night, as they were sifting through a box of old photographs salvaged from a dusty archive, Sarah suddenly stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She was holding a faded black and white photograph, the edges softened with age, depicting a group of young men in crisp suits, standing proudly in front of a newly opened restaurant, Albright's Eateries, emblazoned in bold letters above the entrance. "David," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes wide with disbelief. She pointed to one of the young men in the photograph, a handsome, dark-haired man with a confident smile and striking eyes. Look at this man. Doesn't he remind you of George?" David leaned closer, peering at the faded photograph, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. He studied the young man's face, comparing it to the weathered, aged features he had come to know so well in the warehouse corner. The resemblance was uncanny. The same sharp jawline, the same high cheekbones, the same intense, intelligent eyes, only younger, brighter, full of life and ambition. A cold wave of realization washed over Sarah's face. She reached for another photograph in the box, then another, and another, her hands shaking now, sifting through the faded images, each one revealing more and more of the undeniable truth. There, in photo after photo, was George Albright in his youth, a vibrant, successful businessman, full of promise and vitality. And in several of the photographs standing beside him, a younger, softer version of a face that was achingly familiar to Sarah, a face she knew intimately from childhood photographs and faded memories. Her father. Sarah stared at David, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, dizzying comprehension. "David," she whispered again, her voice barely audible above the silence of the office, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them both. I think George might have been my father's brother." The silence in Sarah's office after her bombshell revelation was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of city traffic filtering through the skyscraper windows. The faded photograph of George Albright stared up at them from the desk, a silent witness to the unfolding drama, his youthful eyes seeming to hold a knowing gaze. Sarah's breath hitched, her hand trembling slightly as she clutched another old photograph, this one depicting two young men, arms slung casually around each other's shoulders, grinning confidently at the camera. One was unmistakably the young George Albright, vibrant and full of life. The other was her father, Thomas Anderson, in his younger years, a face Sarah knew intimately from countless childhood snapshots and faded portraits on her mother's mantelpiece. It's him," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, her eyes fixed on the photograph as if searching for answers within its faded surface. "My father, with George." David leaned in closer, studying the image, a knot of astonishment tightening in his stomach. The resemblance between the young George in the photograph and the George he had known in his final days was undeniable, a stark bridge connecting a vibrant past to a desolate present, and the presence of Sarah's father in the same frame. It was a coincidence too striking to ignore. Are you sure?" David asked, his voice hushed with a mixture of disbelief and awe. Sarah nodded slowly, almost mechanically, her gaze still fixed on the photograph. I have to be. Look at them, David. It's like looking at two versions of the same family, the same eyes, the same bone structure." She traced a finger over the image of her father's face, then George's, her brow furrowed in concentration. "My mother. She mentioned my father had a close friend named George when they were younger. Before everything changed." "Everything changed?" David prompted gently, sensing a deeper story simmering beneath the surface. Sarah sighed, a long, drawn-out exhale that seemed to release a lifetime of unspoken family history. My father. He wasn't always a lawyer, David. He and George, they started a business together back in the 70s. Albright and Anderson Eateries. That was it, wasn't it? From those newspaper clippings? David nodded, his mind racing, connecting the fragments of information, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicking into place with an almost unsettling clarity. Albright's Eateries, he echoed. Yeah, George mentioned restaurants, said he used to own a chain. Sarah nodded again, her eyes distant, lost in the labyrinth of memory. They were partners, David. Best friends. Started from nothing, built it all together, and then it all fell apart. Her voice trailed off, a shadow passing over her face. What happened? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper, sensing the delicate, painful nature of the story unfolding before him. Sarah hesitated, her gaze drifting away from the photographs, towards the city skyline visible through her office window, a vast expanse of steel and glass shimmering in the afternoon light. Money, she said finally, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It always comes down to money, doesn't it? They had a falling out, a bad one, about finances, about the direction of the business, about everything, I think. She turned back to David, her eyes locking with his, a flicker of vulnerability momentarily softening her usual professional composure. My mother, she never talked about it much, said it was too painful. Just that. My father and George had a terrible argument that George left, and they never spoke again. My father, he rarely mentioned George's name after that. It was like he erased him from his life completely. And your mother, she thinks this George could be the same man? David asked, his voice still hushed with awe. Sarah nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail on her perfectly made-up face. I have to talk to her, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I have to know for sure. An unspoken understanding passed between them. This was no longer just a professional case, a legal puzzle to be solved. It had become something deeply personal, intertwined with Sarah's own family history, her own sense of identity and belonging, the potential inheritance, the secret Swiss bank account. Those were almost secondary now, overshadowed by the weight of this newfound connection, this unexpected link to a past shrouded in mystery and unspoken pain. Do you want me to come with you? David offered gently, sensing Sarah's emotional turmoil, wanting to offer support in whatever way he could. Sarah hesitated, then shook her head slowly. No, she said, her voice stronger now, regaining a semblance of her usual professional control. No, this is something I need to do alone, with my mother. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, her gaze hardening with resolve. But thank you, David, for understanding. Of course, David said softly, his heart aching for Sarah, for the pain he could see flickering beneath her composed exterior. I'll go see her tonight, Sarah said, her voice regaining its usual professional edge. I'll show her these photographs. I'll ask her everything. She stood up abruptly, her movements brisk and businesslike, as if attempting to shake off the emotional weight of the revelation. In the meantime, she continued, her voice firm and focused, we still have work to do. We need to verify the Swiss bank account, gather more information about George Albright's assets, prepare for the legal proceedings. This family connection, if it's real, it just adds another layer of complexity to the case. But our objective remains the same, to find the truth and to secure what is rightfully yours, Mr. Dawson. David nodded, rising to his feet, mirroring Sarah's newfound resolve. The weight on his shoulders hadn't lessened, not exactly, but it had shifted, transformed. It was no longer just the burden of his own struggles, his own financial anxieties. Now it was intertwined with something larger, something older, something deeply human and deeply complex. The weight of family secrets, the echoes of past betrayals, and the fragile hope of uncovering a truth that could change not just his future, but Sarah's as well. The quest for truth had become even more urgent, more compelling, and infinitely more personal. Sarah arrived at her office early the next morning, her eyes shadowed by a sleepless night, but her resolve set firm. The conversation with her mother had been illuminating and emotionally charged. Her mother, initially hesitant and tearful, had eventually confirmed the truth, the long-buried family secret. George Albright was indeed her father's brother, his estranged business partner, the ghost that had haunted their family for decades. The details were fragmented, painful, a tangled web of ambition, betrayal, and unspoken resentment. Sarah's mother spoke of a bitter argument, a permanent rift, and then silence. George had vanished from their lives, his name rarely uttered again, relegated to the shadowed corners of family history. The revelation had left Sarah reeling, a confusing mix of shock, sadness, and a strange sense of connection to this man she had never met. This uncle lost to time and bitterness, who now, through a series of improbable events, had become inextricably linked to her own life and to David's. Despite the emotional turmoil, Sarah focused on the task at hand, verifying the existence of the Swiss bank account. She spent the morning on a flurry of phone calls and secure online inquiries, leveraging her firm's international banking contacts, discreetly probing for any account matching the cryptic details George had provided. The waiting was agonizing, each passing minute stretching into an eternity. Then in the early afternoon, a response came back, concise, coded, but undeniably affirmative. A Swiss bank account under the name of George Albright existed, and the balance. The numbers on the screen shimmered with a dizzying number of digits, a sum that was, to put it mildly, life-altering. Sarah stared at the confirmation on her computer screen, her breath catching in her throat. It was real. The improbable story, the dying man's confession, the tarnished key and cryptic code. It was all real. Disbelief warred with a surge of exhilaration, a dizzying sense of the impossible becoming possible. She immediately called, "David," her voice trembling slightly as she delivered the news. "David, it's real. The account, it exists. And, well, let's just say it's substantial." A stunned silence met her words on the other end of the line. Then, a hesitant, almost incredulous voice. "Real? You're being positive?" Sarah confirmed, a faint smile finally gracing her lips. "The account is there, in George Albright's name, at a bank in Zurich." Another beat of silence, then a rush of words, a jumble of disbelief, gratitude, and nervous excitement. "Sarah, I don't know what to say. This is unbelievable." "I know," Sarah said softly, understanding the whirlwind of emotions David must be experiencing. "It is extraordinary." She paused, gathering her professional composure. "There are still significant legal hurdles to overcome, of course. Accessing the account, proving your claim, navigating international probate law, it won't be simple. But the first hurdle is cleared. We know the asset exists." What do we do now?" David asked, his voice still laced with disbelief. "We go to Switzerland," Sarah said firmly, the decision already made in her mind. "We need to go to Zurich in person, to meet with the bank officials, to initiate the legal process, to claim what is rightfully yours, David." There was a beat of hesitation, then a hesitant agreement. "Switzerland," David repeated, the words sounding foreign and exotic on his tongue, a world away from his reality of warehouses and unpaid bills. I don't even have a passport." "We'll take care of everything, David," Sarah assured him, her voice regaining its confident professional tone. "Passports, flights, accommodations, legal arrangements in Zurich. Leave it all to me. Just be ready to travel in a few days." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah, a whirlwind of efficiency and competence, orchestrated every detail of the trip with meticulous precision. Passports were expedited, flights booked, a discreet, elegant hotel arranged in Zurich's city center, and a meeting scheduled with a reputable Swiss law firm specializing in international estate law. David, meanwhile, felt like he was moving, Through a dream, a surreal landscape of improbable events and dizzying possibilities, he packed a small suitcase, his worn clothes feeling inadequate for the journey to a world he had only seen in movies and magazines. He told Lily about the trip, carefully omitting the more fantastical elements of the story, simply explaining that he had to travel to Europe for business, a vague explanation that seemed to satisfy her teenage pragmatism. On the morning of their flight, David met Sarah at the airport. She was dressed in a sleek charcoal gray suit, radiating competence and quiet confidence, pulling a small, stylish suitcase behind her. He, in his best but still slightly rumpled clothes, felt awkward and out of place beside her polished sophistication. They boarded the plane, settling into their first-class seats, another surreal touch orchestrated by Sarah. A nervous energy thrummed between them. The initial professional distance had dissolved, replaced by a shared sense of purpose, a quiet camaraderie forged in the crucible of their improbable quest. "Nervous?" Sarah asked, turning to David as the plane began to taxi down the runway, the engines roaring to life. Her eyes, usually sharp and analytical, held a flicker of something softer, something almost vulnerable. David managed a wry smile, despite the butterflies fluttering in his stomach. "Nervous? Terrified might be a better word. I haven't been on a plane since, well, never really. And Switzerland, it feels like another planet." Sarah chuckled softly, a warm, genuine sound that eased some of the tension in the air. "Don't worry, David," she said, her voice reassuring. "I've been to Zurich many times. It's beautiful, and I'll be there to guide you every step of the way." As the plane soared into the sky, leaving the familiar skyline of their city behind, David glanced at Sarah, her profile illuminated by the soft cabin light, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He felt a strange mix of emotions: apprehension, excitement, disbelief, and a burgeoning sense of something else, something unexpected, something that had begun to bloom in the space between them, amidst the improbable journey they had embarked upon together. As they flew towards Switzerland, towards the unknown, towards a secret that could change their lives forever, the world outside the airplane window blurred into a canvas of clouds and sky, a vast expanse of possibility stretching out before them, as boundless and unpredictable as the journey of their own hearts. Zurich welcomed David and Sarah with a crisp winter day, the sky a brilliant blue reflecting off the shimmering lake. From their elegant hotel window, David gazed in awe at the vista of the city, a captivating blend of ancient and modern. Red-tiled roofs dotted rolling hills, cobblestone streets wound through the old town, and turquoise canals snaked through the urban landscape, a panorama of flowery, alluring European beauty that stole his breath away. This was a world completely removed from David's everyday life, a stark contrast to his small apartment, the noisy warehouse, and the familiar gray streets of home. He felt overwhelmed, out of place, yet undeniably curious and thrilled. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed quite at home in this setting. She had visited Zurich many times for work and appeared unfazed by the city's timeless charm. After quickly settling into their hotel, Sarah led David to a lawyer's office tucked away in a quiet, tree-lined street, shaded by ancient trees. The Swiss lawyer, a distinguished middle-aged man with impeccable English, was waiting to greet them. The meeting unfolded with formal grace and professionalism. Sarah took the lead, expertly presenting their case file, laying out the compelling evidence, and clearly explaining David's connection to George. David sat beside her, listening attentively, occasionally answering brief questions from the Swiss lawyer. The legal procedures at the Swiss bank proved to be even more intricate and drawn out than anticipated. The requests for documentation, identification, and personal verification seemed endless. The language barrier also presented its challenges, though Sarah skillfully translated and explained every detail to David. There were moments when David felt disheartened and impatient, but Sarah remained a constant source of encouragement and reassurance. Her professionalism, patience, and competence inspired David's admiration and trust more deeply with each passing day. Their days in Zurich weren't solely confined to stressful meetings in law offices and banks. Sarah, mindful of David's potential overwhelm and unfamiliarity, made time to show him the city. They strolled through ancient streets, admired magnificent architecture, savored exquisite Swiss cuisine, and basked in the crisp air by the picturesque Lake Zurich. Amidst this flowery and romantic European backdrop, feelings between David and Sarah blossomed naturally and gently. Their exchanged glances grew warmer, their gestures more caring, and their dinners in elegant restaurants transformed into cherished, intimate moments. They shared stories of their lives, dreams, and hopes, and the loneliness and yearnings they held within. David realized Sarah was not just a brilliant and professional lawyer, but also a kind, insightful woman with a wealth of emotions. Sarah, in turn, seemed to find in David sincerity, warmth, and a steady shoulder to lean on amidst the pressures and exhaustion of her demanding life. One afternoon, after leaving the lawyer's office, Sarah guided David to a quaint cafe nestled in a quiet alleyway. Soft golden afternoon light streamed through the trees, dappling the wooden tables set outside. They sat facing each other, sipping hot coffee and watching people stroll by. "Zurich is beautiful, isn't it, David?" Sarah said, her voice soft, her gaze dreamy as she looked into the distance. David nodded, a gentle smile touching his lips. "Beautiful, and so different. I never imagined I'd have the chance to visit a place like this." Sarah turned to look at David, her eyes gentle and warm. "Life is full of surprises, David," she said softly. "Sometimes the most wonderful things come from the most unexpected places." Sarah's words resonated deeply within David's heart. He gazed into her gray-green eyes, sensing a profound connection, a nameless affection growing between them. He wanted to say something meaningful to Sarah, a word of gratitude, a declaration of budding feelings, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Just then, Sarah's phone abruptly rang, shattering the quiet, romantic ambiance. Sarah answered, listened for a moment, and then her expression shifted dramatically. The gentle serenity vanished, replaced by tension and worry etched across her face. "What? Who is this person?" Sarah questioned urgently into the phone, her voice sharp and serious. "Are you certain? This individual's file, let me cross-reference it." "All right. Thank you for informing me." Sarah ended the call, exhaling a long breath, her face etched with confusion and anxiety. "What is it, Sarah?" David asked, his voice filled with concern. Sarah looked at David, her eyes clouded with unease. "David." That was the Swiss lawyer on the phone. He said, "Someone else has come forward claiming to be a relative of George, also seeking to claim the inheritance." David stared, speechless, disbelief washing over him. "A relative? But George never mentioned any family." Sarah shook her head, her expression grave. "I don't know. The lawyer said this person has provided some documentation to prove a family connection to George. They've also filed a request with the bank to temporarily halt all transactions pending further verification." A heavy silence descended over the cafe. The flowery, romantic Zurich setting around them suddenly felt bleak and uncertain. David felt a cold draft pass through his heart, extinguishing the newly kindled flame of hope. Their quest for truth and justice, it turned out, was still fraught with unexpected obstacles and challenges. And their nascent romantic connection, would it be strong enough to weather this sudden storm? The unexpected emergence of another claimant cast a long shadow over David and Sarah's burgeoning hope. The news hit them like a cold wave, chilling the warm glow of their Zurich idyll and plunging their quest for inheritance into a tense and uncertain battle. "Who is this person?" David asked, his voice tight with apprehension, as they sat across from the Swiss lawyer in his dimly lit wood-paneled office the next morning. The lawyer, Mr. Schmidt, adjusted his glasses and consulted a file on his desk. "A Mr. Edgar Albright," he stated, his tone professional and measured. "He claims to be a nephew of the deceased George Albright." Sarah leaned forward, her brow furrowed. A nephew? George never mentioned a nephew. He spoke of siblings, long gone, estranged. Family histories can be complex, Ms. Anderson, Mr. Schmidt replied diplomatically. Mr. Edgar Albright has provided documentation, birth certificates, family records, that appear to support his claim. We are, of course, in the process of verifying their authenticity. What kind of documentation? Sarah pressed, her lawyer instincts kicking into high gear. Mr. Schmidt hesitated, then offered a carefully worded reply. Suffice to say, Ms. Anderson, that they are reasonably convincing on the surface. However, given the circumstances and the significant sum involved, the bank is legally obligated to investigate all claims thoroughly. All transactions on the account are temporarily suspended until the matter is resolved. A heavy silence settled in the room. David felt a familiar wave of discouragement wash over him. Just when they seemed to be on the verge of success, another obstacle had appeared, bigger and more daunting than any they had faced so far. So, what does this mean? David asked, his voice low. Does this ruin everything? Sarah reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on David's arm. Not necessarily, David, she said, her voice firm and determined. It just means we have a fight on our hands, and we will fight. Turning back to Mr. Schmidt, her gaze sharpened. We will, of course, contest this claim, Mr. Schmidt. We believe Mr. Dawson here has the legitimate right to this inheritance, based on the direct wishes of the deceased. And so began the legal battle in the heart of Zurich. Sarah, with her sharp legal mind and unwavering determination, spearheaded the fight, meticulously dissecting Edgar Albright's claims, challenging the validity of his documentation, and presenting their own evidence, David's testimony, the key, the code, the compelling circumstantial evidence of George's intentions. Days blurred into a tense whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, scrutinizing documents, gathering evidence, and strategizing legal maneuvers. The elegant beauty of Zurich faded into the background, overshadowed by the urgent demands of their legal struggle. Yet amidst the stress and uncertainty, something remarkable happened. The bond between David and Sarah deepened and solidified. The shared adversity forged a new level of trust and intimacy between them. They spent hours working side by side, supporting each other through moments of frustration and doubt, celebrating small victories, and offering comfort during setbacks. Sarah, usually so composed and self-contained, revealed glimpses of vulnerability. To David, sharing her anxieties, her exhaustion, her quiet determination to see justice prevail. David in turn found strength and reassurance in Sarah's unwavering resolve, her sharp intellect, and the unexpected warmth that now softened her professional demeanor. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of legal wrangling, Sarah and David found themselves seeking refuge in the quiet intimacy of their hotel bar. Over glasses of rich Swiss wine, they talked, not about legal strategies or bank accounts, but about themselves, their lives, their hopes and fears. You know, Sarah said softly, gazing at David across the dimly lit table. Before all of this, I was starting to think I had become incapable of surprise. My life had become so predictable, so compartmentalized. Work, routine, duty. That was it. She paused, a faint smile touching her lips. And then you walked into my office with your incredible story and this key, and suddenly everything changed. David met her gaze, his heart softening at the vulnerability he saw in her usually sharp eyes. You changed things for me too, Sarah, he admitted, his voice quiet, sincere. Before George, and before you, life was just about survival. Just getting through the day. Now, he hesitated, searching for the right words. Now there's hope, and something more. Their eyes locked, the unspoken words hanging in the air between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. The something more was undeniable now, a quiet current of attraction and affection that had been growing steadily beneath the surface of their professional partnership. The legal battle raged on, days turning into weeks, each day bringing new challenges, new obstacles, new anxieties. Then, in a seemingly insignificant detail buried within a stack of old family documents, Sarah found it. A discrepancy, a small but crucial inconsistency in Edgar Albright's family tree, a hidden thread that, when pulled, began to unravel the entire fabric of his claim. It was a birth record, misfiled, overlooked, almost lost to time. It revealed a hidden truth about Edgar Albright's lineage, a carefully concealed secret that exposed his claim as fraudulent, a desperate attempt to fraudulently claim an inheritance that was not rightfully his. Armed with this newfound evidence, Sarah confronted Mr. Schmidt, the Swiss lawyer, presenting the irrefutable proof of Edgar Albright's deception. The revelation sent ripples through the legal proceedings. Edgar Albright's claim crumbled under scrutiny, his carefully constructed facade of legitimacy shattered. Finally, after weeks of tension and uncertainty, the news arrived. David's claim to the inheritance was legally recognized. The Swiss bank account and the substantial fortune it held was rightfully his. A wave of relief, disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude washed over David, leaving him weak in the knees. He had done it. Against all odds, against all logic, he had actually done it. He had found the truth, honored George's last wish, and secured a future for himself and Lily he could only have dreamed of weeks ago. In the quiet of their Zurich hotel room that evening, after the whirlwind of legal victory had subsided, David turned to Sarah, his heart overflowing with emotion. "Sarah," he began, his voice thick with feeling, I don't know how to thank you for everything, for believing in me when no one else did, for fighting for me like you were fighting for yourself." Sarah smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes, illuminating her entire face. "You don't have to thank me, David," she said, her voice gentle. "It was my honor, and it was the right thing to do." She paused, her gaze softening further, a hint of vulnerability returning to her eyes. "But, David," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "it wasn't just about the case, was it?" David's heart leapt in his chest. He reached out, taking Sarah's hand in his, their fingers intertwining, a silent connection sparking between them. He looked into her eyes, seeing not just the sharp professional lawyer, but the warm, compassionate woman who had stood by him through every twist and turn of this incredible journey. "No, Sarah," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "It wasn't just about the case." He paused, gathering his courage, letting the unspoken feelings that had been growing between them finally find voice. "It's about you." Sarah's breath hitched, her cheeks flushing a delicate pink. She met his gaze, her eyes shimmering, with unshed tears, reflecting the flickering candlelight in the room, and something else, something deeper, something that mirrored the emotions rising within David's own heart. Love. And then, in the heart of flowery Europe, amidst the echoes of legal battles won and lost, amidst the whispers of a shared journey and a burgeoning connection, David leaned in and kissed Sarah. It was a kiss that tasted of relief, of gratitude, of hope, and of the undeniable, unexpected magic of a love that had blossomed in the most improbable of circumstances. The flight back to America felt different. The nervous tension that had permeated their journey to Switzerland was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment and a burgeoning hope for the future. David looked out the window as the plane descended, the familiar cityscape of his hometown rising to meet them, no longer seeming gray and oppressive, but now bathed in a hopeful, golden light. They returned to a life transformed. The inheritance, once an improbable dream, was now a tangible reality. David and Sarah navigated the legal procedures to transfer the funds from the Swiss bank, a process made smoother by Sarah's expertise and the reputable Swiss law firm they had engaged. Within weeks, the impossible had become commonplace. David had access to a life-altering sum of money. The changes were immediate and profound. The first and most pressing need was to alleviate the crushing weight of financial strain that had defined David's existence for so long. Debts were paid off, bills vanished, the ever-present anxiety about money finally began to recede. The battered beast was replaced by a reliable, safe family car. The cramped, dimly lit apartment gave way to a comfortable, sun-drenched house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, complete with a small garden where Lily could finally have the dog she had always dreamed of. Lily, initially bewildered by the sudden shift in their fortunes, blossomed in the newfound security and comfort. College applications became a reality, not just a distant aspiration. She enrolled in her dream university, her path illuminated by the financial freedom her father had unexpectedly secured. But beyond the material changes, the most significant transformation was in David himself. The weariness that had etched lines on his face began to soften, replaced by a lightness, a renewed sense of purpose. The constant knot of anxiety in his stomach loosened, replaced by a quiet sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He didn't forget George. How could he? The memory of the kind, weary, homeless man, the improbable friendship forged in the warehouse corner, the extraordinary secret entrusted to him. It was all woven into the fabric of his new life. David knew that George wouldn't want him to squander the inheritance on frivolous luxuries. He remembered George's quiet dignity, his inherent generosity, and his unspoken wish to make a difference in the world. Following George's spirit of compassion, David established a foundation in George's name, dedicated to providing shelter and support for the homeless in their city. He used a significant portion of the inheritance to fund the organization, creating a lasting legacy for the man who had changed his life in such an unexpected way. It was David's way of honoring George's memory, of paying forward the kindness he had received, and of ensuring that others in desperate need might find a glimmer of hope, just as he had. And then there was Sarah. Their journey to Switzerland, the shared challenges and triumphs, the blossoming romance amidst the legal battles, it had forged a bond deeper and stronger than either of them could have anticipated. What had begun as a professional partnership had blossomed into a deep, abiding love. Sarah, shedding the carefully constructed walls of her professional persona, revealed a warmth, a vulnerability, a depth of emotion that David found both captivating and deeply comforting. David, in turn, offered Sarah a sense of stability, of genuine affection, and a love that was grounded in shared experience and mutual respect, a love that promised to be a true partnership in every sense of the word. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, woven into the fabric of their transformed lives. They built a home together in the new house, a space filled with laughter, shared dreams, and the quiet comfort of companionship. They navigated the challenges of blending their lives, each bringing their own past experiences and individual strengths to their shared future. Their love wasn't a whirlwind romance, but a slow, steady burn, a quiet flame that promised to warm and illuminate their lives for years to come. Years later, David, Sarah, and Lily stood together on the porch of their warm, inviting home, bathed in the golden light of a setting sun. Lily, now a confident young woman embarking on her own career path, laughed as their newly adopted dog, a scruffy terrier mix Lily had named George, chased butterflies in the blooming garden. David looked at Sarah, her hand nestled warmly in his, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange of love and gratitude. The weight on David's shoulders was gone, replaced by the gentle warmth of Sarah's presence, the comforting rhythm of Lily's laughter, and the quiet joy of a life transformed. He thought of George, of the improbable chain of events that had led him to this moment, this life, this love. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes, and knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within his soul, that even in the darkest of times, hope can bloom in the most unexpected corners. Kindness can ripple outwards in unforeseen ways, and sometimes, just sometimes, life can surprise you with a future brighter than you could ever have imagined. And that brings us to the end of David and Sarah's incredible journey. a story about kindness, unexpected connections, and the transformative power of hope. We hope you were as moved by their story as we were to share it with you. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how stories can connect us, no matter where we are. If you enjoyed David and Sarah's story, and you want to discover more heartwarming and inspiring tales, please hit that subscribe button and join our community. We have many more stories just like this waiting to be shared. From all of us here, thank you so much for